Out of all the Overwatch League franchises, the Shanghai Dragons has always been one of the most captivating for a multitude of reasons, having one of the most absurd stories out of any franchise in anything I've ever seen, going through one of the most grueling situations you could ever be in, somehow taking this and ascending to the top, then ending off right where they started. Today, we are going to look at the fall, rise, then fall again of the Shanghai Dragons. The Shanghai Dragons were one of the original 12 organizations that fell into the Overwatch League money pit scheme back in 2017, preparing for the following year's inaugural season, owned by NetEase, which is a Chinese organization, the same company that holds the licensing deal for Activision Blizzard games, looking to build a primarily Chinese roster. Now, it's very important to mention, early days of Chinese Overwatch, before the Leaves and Shies were of age, that scene was sort of a ridiculous region. The player quality wasn't the greatest, and if you want to be harsh, it still isn't outside of a few select players that are truly elite. So expectations were pretty low for Shanghai. I doubt anyone outside of people who were trying to watch every early Overwatch tournament knew who any of these players were. Everyone was interested in the best of the best play, and this is where people started figuring out Korea is the fake natty daddy region. Coming off of Apex Season 4, teams like NYXL and London Spitfire were hyped beyond all comprehension, so gauging where Shanghai was on the tier list is really hard to say. This was before the day and age of everyone making tier lists about the most mundane things. If I had to guess, they were presumably quite low, but no matter how low anyone's expectations were, not a soul would sit there and believe what they were about to witness. As the season opened, teams were getting their bearings, people were figuring out who was good and who was bad, watching their favorite players from Apex or even streamers, since a few of those characters crossed over into the league. It was an exciting time to watch the chaos unfold of whichever franchise they hoped would do well and take everything in due to it all being so new. Games were played, some teams won, some teams got losses, where the Shanghai Dragons were slowly racking up a lot of those. Match after match, something just seemed off, a strange inability to close out a series. You could tell these players were actually trying and not being stupid, intentionally throwing. Some maps and even matches were close. There were inklings of talent, very small amounts, but they did exist. Undead, or Undad as he's known as now, one of the players the Overwatch Church deemed as a heretic and excommunicated him partway through 2018 due to his antics, but he was genuinely a good hitscan player. If anyone ever showed up, it was either him or Dia. The rest existed. I think that's the best way to put it. Stage 1 ended 0-10, where people laughed, of course, kick the bad team while they're down, or even skip out watching their matches, which was the right move because the 0-10 trend continued into stage 2. But after this stage, giving credit where credit is due, Shanghai actually noticed something was wrong, like who would have thought, and made an attempt to fix it, dropping some players and getting a few new ones for stage 3, their biggest pickups being Gigery and Fearless, in hopes of turning this already sunken ship around, where unfortunately that just didn't happen. Retooling the roster, changing some pieces, putting real tanks on the team, nothing seemed to work. The laughter people had about Shanghai in the beginning turned into sadness. It was so bad to the point Dia got player of the match. The only moment in Overwatch League history where the losing team had a player who got that accolade. He did play well, but if I was told he got the award out of pity, I would believe it. That is how down bad Shanghai was during this time period. Looking at the results of 2018 Shanghai is genuinely depressing, having a 0-10 stage 3 and 0-10 stage 4. Regardless of metas, trying different players, attempting unique styles, anything they tried to do, nothing availed, with all of their stages equating to 0-40. Something that is genuinely absurd to the point a ritual must have been done to curse this roster before 2018 Overwatch League began. This just shouldn't happen. It just can't. But it did. Out of 40 matches, not a single victory royale could be achieved. even against the likes of Florida Mayhem, who were rotten in 2018. Making me question, if you could run this through a simulation, how many times would Shanghai Dragons go 0-40? There's just no way it would end like this 100% of the time. So I think a curse is the only explanation, like that Courage the Cowardly Dog, King Ramses III shit. The whole situation is just unimaginable, really. Surely viewers thought the players stopped caring partway into the season due to the results, but this is simply not true. According to Custa, who played on the Dallas Fuel, also the Valiant later on, stated Shanghai Dragons were the first in the facility scrimming and the last to leave every day. Any moment Dallas Fuel needed a scrim partner, Shanghai would always answer the call, making this situation even more depressing. They were actually putting in the time and still losing every single match. This team got to a point where other teams were actually scared of them, not because they were great. It was just due to how abhorrent Dragons were. As all those losses started to rack up, you really don't want to be the team that drops a match to a squad that is 0-35. Dragons had nothing to lose. Playoff dreams were out the window halfway into the season, so the coin flipped on its head for everyone else to perform. I honestly cannot imagine how the Shanghai players felt mentally through this situation. Presumably embarrassment, a clear laughing stock, and if we use the compassionate part of our brain for a second, the fact some of these people didn't all just quit or completely give up is actually astounding to me. How many people would sit through that unless they were getting stacks on stacks as a salary? Which is a possibility since NetEase is one of the Mr. Krabs adjacent characters for China tech companies. Even with that though, I'd assume the mental anguish would be enough to never even look at this game again. For players like Fearless, who came into the equation later on, just experiencing the back half of the 0-20, but somehow still continue to grind is wild. You also need to remember, each and every one of these losses were in front of real people on stage, all 40 of them, being a knife twist for the whole situation. The one positive thing, though, is they didn't need to face the embarrassment of losing in front of the real MVP of 2018 Grand Finals, so some dignity remained intact. After this year was done and over with, everyone just associated Dragons with shit, but weirdly, they acquired a lot of fans in the same breath. As the number of losses became bigger and bigger, people slowly became more and more interested, keeping them engaged with Shanghai's matches. Initially, it was skip out on their games because they suck. Then after 0-20, it became tuning in to see if they would actually win. Which obviously that didn't happen, and those new fans watched a continual downfall until their last match against the Shock. But they were still hopeful for 2019 to see if Dragons can accomplish something, and that accomplishment is just win a match. A low bar that seemed impossible to jump over at this point, but it's inevitable they will get one eventually. Some may ask how this is a fall when Shanghai didn't have much hype or excitement behind them to begin with. The answer to that is quite easy: 0-40. For this 2019 season, instead of a few pieces being changed out, Shanghai changed their roster completely, getting some up-and-comers, acquiring Gamsu, who was a serviceable main tank for Boston Uprising in 2018. Geguri was still here, so people were thinking, there's no way Dragons can lose now. We have new players, new staff, everything is going to be great. Until their opening match started, going against the Hangzhou Spark, where they lost 1-3, and the immediate thought was just like, don't tell me this is actually going to happen again. Second match against Vancouver Titans, 0-4 for Shanghai, where in the moment you'd probably get anxiety for the players there. Shanghai was 0-42 as a franchise, being the longest loss streak for any professional sports team in history, that being for esports or traditional. This news spread to normies and people who don't even play Overwatch. Like, that's how big of a deal this situation was. The previous holder of this record was the Philadelphia 76ers, who lost 28 matches in a row until Shanghai came around and beat it. And to this day, the 0-42 record still stands. But on February 22nd, 2019, the big moment happened. Shanghai Dragons versus Boston Uprising, where that 0-42 would finally become 1-42.
They're all down on the point, starting to take their way up. The first one getting ready to come through. The comes down, Yongjin staying alive. Kellick's knocked down to half HP. The first tick gonna be gained.
You can feel it.
Almost there, pushing from the back. They're ticking up again. No, it's gonna be hacked. He's gonna be taken out of the mech. Finished off.
It's happening.
This could be it. The second tick getting ready to come through. Kellick's gonna be eliminated. Transcendence is out from Aim God, but it's gonna expire. They will be able to finish him off.
There you go.
They're gonna get it. Just a couple more percent to go. Let them have it, Boston. Axiom, popping the primal rage, but it does not matter. Ladies and gentlemen, history has been made. The Shanghai Dragons on the 43rd attempt out.
The pop after Shanghai's first win is one of the most vocal in Overwatch history. You'd think they just won the grand finals. Like, you actually have people crying here. It was a massive day for the organization as a whole. And now, it would have been even more special if this was the same roster from 2018, but obviously those players needed to be dropped, so unfortunately it was not possible for them. This victory made fans curious of how far Dragons could go. If they could get one win, could they actually get another? Where thankfully they did. Stage 1, Dragons scraped by going 3-4, playing bits of GOATs, but also showing attempts of breaking the mold. This GOATs comp was seen as unbreakable, and a lot of teams were reluctant to find a way around it, which is why everyone played it, either traditional, that being Zen, Brig, Lucio, Rein, D.Va, Zarya, or the ultimate switcheroo variation of Sombra GOATs, which is just putting in Sombra instead of D.Va. The best part of the 2019 season was watching the teams that were clearly horrible at it beat their heads against the wall. I'm sure plenty of viewers remember the classics brought to us by teams like Washington Justice or Florida Mayhem. Seeing them have no improvement, no anything, aside from casters, analysts, and viewers losing their minds. Unless you were watching a top team play GOATs, this comp is quite boring to watch, especially when you see it for 2 stages straight, each team playing 7 matches on top of the stage playoffs. Viewer fatigue is going to happen. I genuinely don't understand how watching this would have been for a casual viewer. Them trying to figure out what is happening in these fights probably blew their minds. Needless to say, most people wanted something to change. After we got the good Stage 2 final, we had enough at that point, and where the balanced team wouldn't make the play and step in to make changes, Shanghai Dragons would. In Stage 2, Shanghai showed a slight upswing compared to their Stage 1 performance, going from 3-4 to 4-3, as a franchise reaching 7 wins, which is pathetic to be blunt, but seeing any progress from them was welcomed. By Stage 3, their ability to play GOATs increased, primarily opting for Sombra GOATs, not a top team or anything, just battling for an upper mid position. But this stage is when Shanghai started utilizing a DPS comp, which did appear to throw some teams off. The highlight of it all was undoubtedly Ding's Pharah. He got unreal amounts of value consistently. DM was also exceptional on Widow. Then you got Yongjin, a player that was completely ruined by one clip. Surely everyone has seen his infamous C9.
Oh, Yongjin.
Oh my god. That was actually a C9.
That is a big old C9.
This is probably the worst C9 in Overwatch history. No one was shooting him or even near him. He just walked off the cart. And this is all anyone remembers about Yongjin, and forget how he actually was good. He played a lot of Doom and Roadhog in Stage 3 and did his job and then some on both heroes. Seeing this made viewers more engaged and actually root for Shanghai, since out of all the teams trying something unique, they were the best. Once again, being the underdog. But this time, instead of people hoping for them to come close to winning a series, people wanted to see how far they would go in the stage, where they ended at 5-2, one of the better records overall actually, and their best stage up to this point. Going into stage playoffs, Shanghai weren't even in the conversation of making finals, or even beating the likes of NYXL, Titans, or Shock. Previously, during this stage, Shanghai was mixing in the DPS comps with GOATs, but Stage 3 playoffs is where they decided this DPS comp was the answer to GOATs, making them the dark horse team of the bracket, with their first opponent being NYXL, who again was not a bum team. Shanghai was just making them look like one. They did not have an answer to what the Dragons were doing, forcing them to scramble and adapt on the fly. It was unreal in the moment, seeing a team who just finished this stage 7-0 pushed against the wall and lose to Shanghai Dragons 3-1. It was a massive upset to say the least. The despair turned into curiosity and hope, with their next opponent being Vancouver Titans. Instead of being a 0% chance at victory, that probably turned into a 30%. Odds were still not in Shanghai's favor, but as the church says, 99% of gamblers quit before they win big, and for Dragons' case, thankfully they didn't quit because they did win big. Almost a repeat of what happened with NYXL happened to Vancouver. Titans just didn't know what to do. Shanghai were playing so well, countering the comp people thought was impossible to counter. Ding on Pharah was getting an unreal amount of value, Luffy on Ana was a silent carry, on top of everyone playing up and even beyond their opposition, defeating Titans 4-1, creating two of the biggest upsets possible back to back, where just the final boss, San Francisco Shock, stood in their way. Even with this uptrend for Dragons, people still had Shock winning. They had the first golden stage, and most considered them the best team at this point, so it was reasonable for viewers to think they are going to win. Maybe Shanghai would get a map or two, but Shock will close this series out. As we entered the first stage final of 2019 that had a match that wasn't Shock versus Titans, it was genuinely interesting to see what would happen. The best GOATS team versus the one who played the counter. Fans got what they wanted, a different team comp, with the carrot on a stick question people asked when they first saw Shanghai pull this out. Is this truly the counter to GOATS? The Stage 3 final was going to answer that, where in the beginning, it looked to be the case. Dragons took map 1, then map 2, and then map 3, up 3-0 against the Shock. But Shock, with all of their magic, or whatever you want to call it, started to bring it back around, taking a map, and then another map, and finally, the last one, bringing the series to 7. The intrigue of this match was crazy from so many angles. Being impressed with Shanghai for how they were able to push the 3 best teams Overwatch League had at the time to their absolute limit, and with Shock being able to adapt their play on the fly to counter what Shanghai was doing, almost reverse sweeping them, where unfortunately for them, they did not. Shanghai actually won. Shanghai had the hardest possible bracket for victory and beat them all to get their first stage title. The hype for them was at an all-time high. From their previous season, 0-40, to winning a stage, and yes, we know it's a different roster, bitch, we can read, you're just missing the point. As a franchise, a turnaround of this magnitude was unbelievable. They just made a record for the longest loss streak in history, won their first match in 2019, had arguably the loudest pop in Overwatch League. On top of this, they had the team who went against the grain to defeat GOATS, a comp everyone, even most coaching staff, felt was unbeatable. This is one of the biggest seasons for a franchise, period. Of course, they went on to have a very rough Stage 4, going 1-6, and not make it anywhere during playoffs. But having 2 monumental achievements like that is nothing to scoff at, and little did anyone expect the rise was only going to continue. The 2020 season was yet another look for Shanghai, keeping a few of the players from previous, but adding new ones on top. Stand 1 was added, Fearless came back, Fleta joined from Seoul Dynasty, Void came from the Gladiators, and 2 new rookies, Lee Jae-gon and Lip, were signed. They had Dia on a 2-way contract with Team CC, while retaining Geguri, Luffy, Izuyaki, DM, and Ding. This roster was fucking massive. 4 tanks, 5 DPS, and 3 supports. The reception of this team was in the middling area. During this time period, no one knew Fearless was good yet, Lip was a nobody, Izuyaki barely played, people were low on Fleta because his last 2 seasons on Seoul Dynasty were not great. Void was fine on Gladiators, just not a Janu or Choi Hyobin coming off of 2019. But no matter the reception, people were still optimistic. On top of this new look for Shanghai, the 2020 season in totality was an over-ambitious year for Overwatch League, going with a homestand model, forcing players to travel around constantly, which would never work for an esport. But this model couldn't go forward regardless, since the forbidden illness came and closed our world down, creating the region split of North America and APAC, which remained until Overwatch League ended. 13 teams in North America and 7 in APAC. Shanghai, NYXL, Seoul Dynasty, Guangzhou Charge, Hangzhou Spark, Chengdu Hunters, and London Spitfire got stuck in APAC, while everyone else stayed in North America. Unfortunately, viewers of APAC were stuck watching the same 7 teams go against each other, but they hoped, since they're going against each other so many times, it would help them learn and adapt to each other's playstyles, making the region more competitive, which it was like that for some of the teams. But for Shanghai, the situation was much different. Everything we've talked about so far, Shanghai getting their first win, improving throughout 2019, getting a stage title, going from a 0-40 season to a 13-15 season, pales in comparison to how fucking dominant 2020 Shanghai was. We are talking like barely losing maps. During the beginning, it appeared Shanghai Dragons were not sure who to put where. All-time classic moments like putting Stand 1 over Fearless on Winston, where that alone explains the confusion Dragons had. But I guess it didn't matter because they were non-stop winning regardless of who was in, only having slight moments of pushback from other teams. On their second match, Chengdu somehow defeated Dragons 3-0, a very strange one, I'd say, then a 3-2 loss to Seoul Dynasty a bit later on in the year. And that's it. 2 losses throughout the entire regular season. A complete 180 from 2018. No matter the meta, the hero pool, or opponent they had, Shanghai was just better. Once they figured out who their core players were, it was just over for everyone else. Fearless, Void, Fleta, Lip, Izzyaki, and Lee Jae-gon were all some of the best players in their role without question. We actually got to see this roster's discovery in real time during one of the greatest matches in Overwatch history, May Melee Finals, Shanghai Dragons versus Seoul Dynasty. That reverse sweep started once they figured out the hidden tactic of not putting Lip and Fearless on the bench. Watching the immaculate play from this core was like viewing art being done right in front of you. Fearless grinded his way through contenders, came back and began the redemption arc, equivalent to an anime storyline. Unbelievable Winston mechanics, only seen by Gushue and Smurf. Void was being compared to or even praised more than Choi Hyobin by some. I've been saying it since the end of this season, but Void was robbed of MVP, undoubtedly. He was just 0 mistakes to player on off-tank. Fleta finally came into form, being the person he was expected to be in 2018. Essentially a beta build of proper, having the ability to play hit scan and flex DPS to a very high level. 2020 is where the Fleta is meta thing became popularized from. He always fit into the roster regardless of the hero he played. Lip was a player that had no hype behind him, who ended up being clearly the best Sombra around, with hitscan mechanics rivaling the Ons and Carpes of the world. And finally, Lee Jae-gon and Izzyaki had the immediate synergy expected from a champion tier backline, appearing to function on the same wavelength. There was just no competition in APAC outside of one speed bump Shanghai had, them losing Summer Showdown to Guangzhou Charge. This loss is presumably why Moon signed Who Are You, in case there is ever a Genji meta, which may come into play 2 years after this. The 2020 Summer Showdown brought Shanghai's losses up to 3 for the season, and their final stage Countdown Cup was a breeze for Dragons, where they just dominated everyone, including Hangzhou in the finals, ending their regular season 27-2, acquiring 2 stage titles. In the span of 3 years, we've gone through 0-40 to getting their first win, acquiring their first stage title, ending the season 14-14, to now arguably having the best players in the world on their team, putting an entire region in a headlock and winning 2 more titles. Looking at this from a franchise perspective, it's truly a wild ride to experience everything unfold, going from the longest loss streak in professional anything to being in the Final 4. The top 2 teams from North America and the top 2 teams from APAC were going to have their chance at winning a ring. Philadelphia Fusion and San Francisco Shock from North America, Shanghai Dragons and Seoul Dynasty from APAC. Most were pretty low on Seoul Dynasty, while having the others being close in skill, which actually was the case. Everyone just got the wrong team. Fusion was the one that sucked. Like, genuinely, they were so far below Seoul, Shanghai, and Shock, it was laughable. Rewatching these playoff matches was interesting. Lots of people pretend that Shock was just the best by miles, but that's not remotely true. The first Seoul Shock match was a 3-2, Shock Shanghai was a 3-2, and Seoul Shanghai was a 3-2. Each of these teams were very closely matched in this meta. Shock just improved enough by the time Grand Finals came around for them to win their second ring. It's quite difficult to say this is a disappointing end from Shanghai. Their third place was hyper competitive. If they got a Fusion result, then sure, that would have been a failure. Regardless of placing though, we know how talented this roster was, and it wouldn't break apart. The roster was clearly champion tier. All 6 of these players got Role Star, and Fleta got MVP. So in some sense, yeah, I guess it is rotten they got third place. 2021 would undoubtedly be another chance for them to get a ring. The only question we would have as viewers is if they could actually do it, or would it be a repeat of 2020? And we were off to a pretty bad start with that. One real change was made outside of Who Are You, Develop, and Molly being added, where, let's be real, none of them are going to play outside of trolling matches, or if Genji is hard meta. The big move here was replacing Fearless with Fate. Everyone felt this shift would make or break this roster. Anyone who knows Fearless understands replacing him after his 2020 performances was practically impossible. That's not saying Fate is bad. He was a part of the 2020 Florida Mayhem, who were a good team, and individually Fate performed well. The only problem is that he's not Fearless on Winston. So seeing this unfold was going to be interesting. The one positive thing I can say about this situation though, at least for Shanghai as an org and from the staff perspective, it's respectable they were accepting of Fearless's wants. He wanted to leave Shanghai and join Dallas Fuel, so they let him. The whole situation was assumed to be a bumpy ride for Shanghai, and one we were all excited for. As the season opened, Shanghai lost 3-0 to Chengdu Hunters, just like 2020. They had a close match with Hangzhou Spark 3-2, and beat down the dork teams that suck as expected. Teams were playing a variety of things, still figuring out what the meta was, a normal thing for Overwatch League in the opening weeks. Shanghai did actually look good, and Fate didn't appear to be a problem, so it was a positive thing going forward. We just hoped this situation would continue when they reached the big matches, where we quickly jumped into the staged knockouts. Shanghai had this ridiculously underrated match, a 7-map 3-2 victory over Philadelphia Fusion to actually make it to the stage playoffs. The other matches they played before this pale in comparison to this one. Shanghai winning this brought them to the Final Four. Each stage in 2021 had a similar format to the 2020 playoffs. The 2 best teams from each region meet in a double elimination bracket, where Shanghai got a 3-2 victory over Florida Mayhem, and then lost 3-2 against Dallas Fuel, went against Florida Mayhem again, and then won 3-0, meeting Dallas in the finals. We're glossing over this section quickly, but most of these matches don't matter outside of Shanghai and Dallas Fuel. There was an interesting dynamic here if you take into account how Fearless is going against his old team, and his new replacement tank needed to prove his worth to the Shanghai fans. Unfortunately for those said fans, Dallas Fuel here were just better. Fearless played exceptional, putting Fate into a headlock on main tank, I'd say, spearheading the Fuel into their very first tournament win. The match itself was sort of forgettable from a gameplay standpoint outside of a few highlights, but from a story perspective, it's a lot more interesting, because little did we know, a rivalry was beginning. June Joust was the second and most interesting stage of the year for reasons that will become clear. There's no reason to talk about the qualifiers specifically, rather the meta differences between regions. After the aforementioned region split in 2020, teams were not always on the same page with each other. APAC would have their own meta read, and NA would have theirs, which is why watching the final 4 teams during stage playoffs was so engaging. You're essentially watching a clash of styles. With this specific June Joust hero pool, Dallas Fuel carved out this team comp everyone coined as zombie comp. It's very hard to watch for some people, but Dallas created it, and the comp was so oppressive, you had to mirror it. So basically every team in North America were utilizing it. Some teams did try other things, but primarily it was this zombie comp. APAC, on the other hand, were just doing weird shit. The comps played were nowhere close to what North America was playing, having variations of double shield or dive. Shanghai were again a top team in the region because individually these players were so good. The only loss Shanghai had during the June Joust qualifiers was against Hangzhou Spark, ending 3-0, just like the bizarre loss they had against Chengdu Hunters during May Melee. But the Dragons still beat their way into the Final Four, with those teams being Shanghai Dragons, Atlanta Reign, Dallas Fuel, and NYXL of all teams. We were excited to see how the meta reads would clash, immediately getting to watch Shanghai versus Dallas Fuel, where the Dragons just got ass blasted. They were continuously swapping around where nothing availed, inevitably attempting to mirror Dallas Fuel with Fate Winston, but as we said in the beginning, Fate isn't bad, he's just not fearless on Winston. This was the moment everyone thought like how detrimental losing Fearless was to Shanghai Dragons. We saw little bits of it in May Melee, but here it exacerbated the issue more. If Dragons need to keep going against Dallas Fuel with Winston comps, they're fucked. This match was not close at all. Shanghai went into the lower bracket with NYXL, where whoever won that was assumed to get annihilated by Atlanta Reign. The NA comp just looked better, and APAC's read was not going to cut it here. And again, none of these teams had a Winston that could compete with Fearless, who was the front-running MVP candidate at this point. But it appears Shanghai noticed this exact same thing because something changed here. Right out the gate against NYXL, Shanghai showed a sort of new look, utilizing Dallas's team comp, but instead Shanghai replaced the Winston with Ball, where they looked really good against NYXL, but it's NYXL, like no one thought much of them and they didn't really belong here in the first place. Shanghai could have played drunk, high, sleepless, and still beat this team. So Atlanta Reign was a more interesting opponent. Everyone expected Shanghai to lose this match, which was furthest from the truth. That match against NYXL was not just a 3-0 because NYXL sucked, it's because Shanghai genuinely leveled up as a team. Both Atlanta Reign and Dragons played a double shield style with a mixture of the zombie comp, having close bouts in between, with Shanghai etching out each map, winning 3-0 against them too, making the rivalry no one knew was birthed during May Melee come into reality. Dallas Fuel versus Shanghai Dragons in the finals once again. It was an exciting time for each respective franchise's fan bases, but the excitement was immediately snuffed out when the series started. Shanghai was getting absolutely pummeled. Map 1 and Map 2 were not close at all. Dallas just knew this comp inside and out, looking infallible at it, where you'd hope that's the case because they've been playing it for over a month now and they created it. But thankfully for Shanghai, Map 3 was a slight improvement. Dragons barely got a win on the board. Even with them getting the map win though, you could still tell Dallas was the better team and were expected to win the series. Map 4 is where I would say this match truly became interesting. After winning the previous, Shanghai seemed to slowly be getting up to Dallas's level. We could see each fight, each point was getting progressively closer and closer. Adaptations to Shanghai's playstyle was being made, their execution was getting better, where of course Shanghai lost this map, but if you were paying attention, there was a real possibility of this series going the distance. In real time, we could see them pushing the envelope. If you compare how Shanghai looked from map 1 to map 5, there was a tangible difference. And the competitive nature continued right into Busan, with the biggest highlight being round 3's ending. The needed masterful execution from Shanghai showed its head in the final fight. Shanghai winning this just shouldn't happen. Whether you want to attribute this to Dallas playing bad here or Shanghai playing well is up to you. Regardless of it, this series really should have ended 4-1 for Dallas here, but thankfully it didn't. since this was a stage final that deserved to go the distance. Ike was map 6, with Shanghai and Dallas continuously battling it out, having fights that were being won by pubic hairs. The slightest mistakes were being punished. Both teams were just Adderall levels of locked in. At this point in the series, a nuclear war could begin and these players wouldn't even know it's happening. But the only real nuke that was being dropped was the one Shanghai was putting in the face of Dallas after they capped first. It was the first time in the series where Shanghai actually looked to be in control. Dallas looked lost and just didn't know what to do against Shanghai now. Any moment Dallas tried to push the tempo, fate would disrupt their engagement. If Dallas tried to force a mistake or find an opening, Shanghai would outpace them, never giving them a chance to breathe. Then the moment happened. Fearless tilt swap to Roadhog. Shanghai was slowly breaking the team who has been playing this comp for over a month. It may have gotten lost in the sauce after going through everything so quickly, but Shanghai has only been playing this comp for 2 days. Not a single time throughout June Joust qualifiers did Dragons ever use this comp, only at stage playoffs, where they are now pushing Dallas against the wall. The champion mentality unfolded right before our eyes. It takes a very talented group of players to do something like this. But somehow, some way though, Dallas were able to etch it out and somehow cap point 2. But Shanghai stopped it at 3rd, bringing us to map 7, with Dallas Fuel bending the knee. They rolled out on Shanghai's ball comp. It wasn't an awful look for them. Fearless just wasn't Fate on ball, the exact opposite of that worry everyone had about Fate in the beginning. And of course, Shanghai ended up winning this whole series. June Joust 2021 is genuinely one of the best finals matches of all time, and for my money, it is the best final of all time. Them getting this victory was a true testament to how good this Shanghai team was. Again, they were only playing the comp for 2 days. The term Shang AI was birthed from this stage. It looked as if they downloaded their opponents mid-match and found some way to counter what they wanted to do. If the other team started playing up, Shanghai would just play better. Another massive positive was how no one was really worried about Fate anymore. He proved himself to be good enough, he found his big hero and was serviceable on others, and the rest of this roster was exactly like 2020. Izayaki and Lee Jae-gon was an unbelievable backline. Lip truly came into form, being a top 3 DPS in the league. Fleto was still his flexible self, and Void was putting out MVP level performances again. The roster were solidifying themselves as a dynasty. After June Joust was finished, Shanghai continued utilizing Wrecking Ball from here on out. And rather than Shanghai adapting to others, everyone had to adapt to them. Chengdu was the only team who had a close match with Dragons during the stage playoffs. The rest didn't even stand a chance. Dragons learned from all their mistakes going against Chengdu the first time and dominated them in the finals. We didn't even see another Dallas versus Shanghai here because Chengdu knocked them out. If you watched a match of Dragons and you thought you saw them at their best, they'd still find a way to one-up themselves, actually looking unbeatable. Once they moved over to their trademarked comp, that being primarily Ball, Diva, Tracer, Sombra, Brig, Zen, it was just over for everyone. Watching how well this team played around Wrecking Ball is like watching Vancouver Titans or Shock play Goats in 2019. There's honestly nothing really else to say about Dragons after June Joust aside from them being in their own tier. Unless there was a massive meta shift, Shanghai looked to be the default champions of the 2021 season. Everyone else had a lot of catching up to do, and time was running out. Thankfully for the rest of Overwatch League, Shanghai Dragons decided to be nice, and for Countdown Cup, Shanghai publicly said they were sandbagging or taking it easy, as did Dallas Fuel, which raised some eyebrows because that's what NYXL said in 2018, and we all know what happened there. So neither of them qualified for the Countdown Cup stage playoffs, letting Gladiators get their Michael Mouse tournament win against Chengdu Hunters. Bringing us to the end of this season. Playoffs meta was exactly the same as Countdown Cup. We all knew what Shanghai was going to play, Ball, Diva, or Sigma, depending on the map, Sombra Tracer, Brig Zen, 99% of the time. They picked Shock as their first opponent, where for some odd reason, people thought it was a terrible idea until they watched the match and Dragons dunked them right into a trash can 3-0, which alleviated the worries anyone could have about them sandbagging because they looked as good as ever. Dragons went against Gladiators next, who did take a map off of them, but Shanghai still acquired victory 3-1, with a similar result against Dallas Fuel. It was honestly just a blur because they were burning through every team like nothing. Right after Dallas and Glads took their maps away, Shanghai just locked in and adapted around them, returning us back to the whole Shang AI situation. Shanghai was infallible almost to levels we've never seen before, making it hard to say this playoffs was even interesting. No team was even close to Dragons in the end. Atlanta Reign was shockingly the team who made it to Grand Finals against Shanghai Dragons, having a miraculous lower bracket run, accepting their second place finish before the match even began. The players knew they weren't going to win, which is exactly what happened. Anytime Atlanta Reign played up, Shanghai just played even better. It was an inevitable victory. If they did not win a ring here, this would have been a very, very disappointing end. Shanghai won 4-0 over Atlanta Reign, which I guess is fitting for their story, starting out with 40 losses, then adding a dash in between for the time they won the ring. This is the most dominant Grand Finals performance in Overwatch 1. Out of the 4 matches they played, Shanghai only lost 2 maps. Both London Spitfire and Shock Championships were much harder fought than this one. The funniest part of this whole situation, after winning, it looked like Shanghai didn't even care. There was zero excitement, just another day at work. A little part of me hoped for the Shanghai Dragons winless to champion run, there would have been a better fight. If this was a really close finals, that would have been a great thing in general because Overwatch is notorious for having shit one-sided Grand Finals matches. Also, it would have made our closing for the 0-40 to champ story more interesting. There's really nothing you can say outside of them being better than every other team. 2020 and 2021 Shanghai Dragons is one of the best rosters of all time. Unfortunately, some people like to downplay a few of the members on this roster, mainly Fate, where I guess I can understand it. If anyone could have been upgraded, he would have been the player. If Shanghai got a Smurf or even a Fearless back, I think that would have elevated the team a bit more, but it appeared Shanghai Dragons didn't want to replace him and keep this champion core going into 2022. Where Shanghai Dragons immediately got stuck at number 1 above everyone else in preseason power rankings simply due to their playoffs performance. Assuming they would be out of the conversation for dominating APAC was asinine, but we'd soon find out, thinking that may have been a mistake. 5v5 obviously changes how you play tank, and some people were not going to have a seamless transition. Unfortunately for Dragons, they fell into this category. If we compare the Hive Mind equivalent play from 2021 to 2022, something just seemed off here, a noticeable downgrade from the infallible nature we were accustomed to. This was not like last season where Shanghai walks in and puts their opponents inside of a body bag and leaves it for the crows. There was a genuine struggle here. The tank line seriously had issues adapting to 5v5. The pristine, refined engagements didn't exist. Everything was so scrappy, there was a sheer lack of understanding of how to position themselves or capitalize on their opponent's mistakes, which continuously got exposed by other teams. This is not saying Dragons were a shit team, they just weren't the best anymore. Their first stage ended 5-1, which sounds good on paper, but in the same breath, they went to map 5 against Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Valiant, teams they shouldn't even be struggling against, especially Valiant and Guangzhou. Dragons could just pull through in the end because they had a lot of experience in high pressure situations. It is very important to mention there were a lot of internet issues with Shanghai. They were transitioning into a new facility, and there was another large COVID spike in China during this time period, where you could use that to cope with Shanghai's performances, since there is some actual validity to those concerns. So fans were waiting for everything to get situated behind the scenes and see if Dragons could return to form, but they just didn't. Flutta is a massive talking point for this season. Lots of people claimed it looked as if he was playing with his monitor off. I wouldn't say he was trash like a lot of other people do, he was just fine. Fleta was never known as the most mechanically talented player outside of 2017. He was praised for being a very low resource and flexible player, always reliable regardless of meta, hence the Fleta is meta thing. Overwatch 2 was an opening for very mechanically talented DPS players to shine, and there were a lot of new up-and-coming rookies, Proper, Alfie, and Zest, just to name a few. You really needed to be able to lay it down on your opponent, and Fleta's playstyle just didn't really work anymore in 5v5. On top of this, there were also rumors of him wanting to swap over to Valorant, so it's very possible his passion was waning for Overwatch, in turn giving us what we saw in 2022. If we look at the backline, Isiaki and Lee Jae-gon had moments of brilliance, and then others where they looked completely lost. Lip was the only player who actually stayed the same from 2021, being a top Sojourn, who was consistently used since she was broken at this point, forcing him to be the guiding light for Shanghai Dragons. Who Are You was also here, getting bits of playtime over Fleta on Genji. The team did always look better when he was in. Now only if Genji was perma-meta, right? What would happen then? Coming into this season, it really wasn't crazy for anyone to assume Dragons had a chance of getting back-to-back championships. It just became harder and harder for that vision to become a reality when there are so many other teams, even in their own region like Seoul Dynasty, outperforming them. The mid-season madness, I think, was the nail in the coffin for a lot of people when it comes to anyone having that mindset. Shanghai had a 4-2 stage, losing to Seoul and Hangzhou Spark. Their ultimate edition of Bebe played a lot here during this double flex meta. He was just fine. It's a really bizarre addition after coming off winning a ring. You'd figure they'd attempt to get a really hyped up flex support from contenders, or a storied one like Twilight or something. Thankfully, Shanghai made it to the international portion of the stage, so we can see them go against the North American teams. Unfortunately, Shanghai was middling. They did beat Toronto Defiant and Dallas Fuel 3-0, then lost to Atlanta Reign 3-1. This was the stage where everyone started to realize how North America is much stronger this season, with the Gladiators going on to win the whole tournament against Shock, making them the season favorites now. When the stage was done and dusted with, Shanghai wasn't even in the conversation of being a top team anymore, which was quite frustrating since deep down you know these players are really good. You're not going to have a season like 2021 if the team is a group of shitters. Some claimed their weakness was due to Dragons not being able to play their ball comp and they sort of one-tricked it throughout 2021, which could partially be the case, but they did play other things throughout that season and look genuinely good. Of course, more fallible, but still like a top team. It appears the 5v5 style put Shanghai through a loop, and adapting to it was a real struggle for them. Success just didn't look to be in the cards for Dragons in 2022. Until something very weird happened. Summer Showdown, Junker Queen was released, and we were back in 2021 again. Shanghai went from being 3rd, 4th in APAC to being the best. It was a world of mirror metas. Junker Queen Shout was so broken it enabled this comp. Queen, Sojourn, Genji, Brig, Lucio, endlessly. Thankfully for Dragons, the card that was drawn by Moon, one we mentioned back in the 2020 segment, was a massive contributor to why Shanghai was so good. If you want to watch someone pick up a mountain and fucking throw it, watch Who Are You's POVs or highlights from the entirety of this stage. As I said, he did play little bits of the season before, but he was a perma starter this time, and it was glorious. How someone can barely have playtime throughout his career and be this good at Genji is unreal. At times, Who Are You put Lip in his shadow with how much he was doing. Shanghai fans were in the blissful phase of being awed at how stupendous their performances were. Dragons only lost one map during qualifiers. If they 3-0'd Fusion, they would have had a golden stage. Even during stage playoffs, only 2 maps were taken by Seoul Dynasty in the finals, giving Shanghai their 7th title win. That being their combined stages and championship, where some now realized Shanghai is the most successful franchise in Overwatch history. An epiphany coming in the strangest of moments, considering how this season was a struggling one for them, and this stage came completely out of nowhere. Who Are You just changes the team, I guess. This achievement was actually acquired after Dragons won the 2021 Grand Finals. Shock is the franchise who was always considered the most successful due to them winning 2 championships, but technically speaking, Shanghai is. Shock only has 5 wins in total, 2 championships and 3 stages. Dragons have now won 6 stages and 1 ring, which is mind-numbing to even think about. Shanghai Dragons have the polar opposite of accomplishments, the longest loss record ever and the most title wins. How can a franchise be so shit but so amazing at the same time? A sentiment repeated in the Countdown Cup for Dragons in 2022. They came off of winning the Summer Showdown with dominance, and we were right back to consistently struggling again in the same vein as Kickoff Clash, instead going 3-3 here. There were inklings of hopes for playoffs, considering how their almost golden stage came out of nowhere, but after Shanghai got dominated by Hangzhou, it looked grim. People expected the match to go the opposite way because Hangzhou just had a 1-5 stage. Apparently all it took for them was Gushui Winston and Shai Sojourn to dominate the Dragons. And afterwards, they got knocked out by the Shock to end their season. Lip tried his absolute hardest to carry them during this match, but it didn't avail. It's a really quick end, but other teams were just more interesting to pay attention to while obviously looking better overall. Dallas Fuel was on a come-up, who of course won the season. Shock looked great, and even Houston Outlaws did too. Whenever it came to an international event, APAC was just put on the back burner due to the team quality not being as high. I think the most sad part for Dragons was everyone knew the dynasty was going to end for 2023's season, and Shanghai would have a completely new look. One final thing I will say about the Shanghai dynasty is a lot of people do over-exaggerate how bad they were during this season. Shock had a similar situation in 2021 where everyone said they were the worst team and so awful, which wasn't even true. Their weaknesses just started to come out. Some of their star players declined in skill or surpassed by others, as with them having internal issues, but they still had moments of brilliance throughout the season, just like Shanghai. As expected, everyone on this roster became a free agent, where it was assumed Dragons would be making some big moves, considering the sentiment everyone had towards them now, building powerhouse champion tier rosters. You'd be expecting Shanghai to make moves like getting hyped contenders players or acquiring a roster that would have an ability to win another title. Unfortunately, the taste of winning would be going away and we'd be returning to shades of 2018, ending where we started. Before we talk about the 2023 roster, we need to talk about NetEase, where if you remember from all those eons ago, NetEase is the owner of Shanghai Dragons, who held the licensing deal to allow Overwatch to be played in China. The licensing deal between the two came to an end, and both companies were having issues with negotiations. There were some talks of Bobby Kotick, the CEO of Activision Blizzard at the time, feeling threatened by executives at NetEase, with some blaming him as the culprit of their initial split. This is important to Shanghai Dragons because if they are currently having issues settling an agreement with Activision Blizzard and supposedly having friction with each other, why would NetEase want to spend buckets of money on a roster for one of their games? It's just a theory, but it does make some rational sense. Also considering how a lot of the teams were going in a cheaper route for 2023. So we got a classic team out of the situation. Shanghai's first announcement was Coach Moon, who was the head coach of Shanghai since 2020. Decent start. Fleta comes in next, where you'd think it's a serviceable addition until you see he's going to play tank. There's two ways one could look at this pickup. One, Dante did it, so maybe it's possible for Fleta. Two, why would you ever do this? Just get one of the many cheap contenders players that will most likely be better than Fleta would. He was solo tanking too, which made the situation even better. The DPS were Viper and Hisu. No one knew anything about Viper. He was quite literally a Genji one-trick living in the shadows of O2 Blast's better players. Hisu was a genuinely good hitscan player, so we had a slight amount of optimism there. Then we went right into even more despair than Fleta solo tanking when we look at the backline. One consisting of Gangnam Jin and DM. The same DM who was on Shanghai from 2019 to 2021. And better yet, DM hasn't played the game competitively since his retirement, meaning he's coming out of retirement, hasn't played the game in years, and is role swapping. Presumably, he would be playing flex support, so that means Gangnam Jin is on main support again. Another player whose career got ass blasted. Not a soul in the world can describe how awful Gangnam Jin is at main support. The dude is actually a good flex support, so watching his downfall is kinda rough. He's coming off the NYXL team who was 4-20. And needless to say, this Shanghai team was beyond fucked when it was looked at. A recap is you have a player that's never played tank, showing a steady decline in performance in 2022, a Genji one trick no one knew anything about, a good hitscan player, the worst main support from 2022, and a player who role swapped and hasn't played the game at this level since mid-2021. Quite the downgrade from Fate, Void, Lip, Izayaki, and Lee Jae-gon. Depending on who you ask, thankfully DM did not actually play during the season. He was having some personal issues and decided to retire again, being replaced by Iris, who was an upgrade. He was just sadly joining the 2023 Dragons. This was a season where we could wait for it to start. We all knew 2023 Shanghai were going to be a reverse GameStop and visit Satan with how low the stock line would go. Even better, we were in a hard Winston meta, and the opening match for Shanghai was against Hangzhou Spark. Fleta versus Gushue on Winston, where obviously Shanghai got body slammed, a sentiment that repeated for the entirety of this year. There's no sense of reiterating Shanghai bad, since it speaks for itself. They were literally losing to contenders teams. If you want to give one positive about 2023 Dragons, and there really only is one, Viper did shock people with how good he was, especially on Tracer, finishing matches with ridiculous stick rates or dragging his team kicking and screaming on occasion. Outside of this, it was an empty husk of nothing. Fleta was of course rotten on tank. Moon stuck him in a coaching position, signing Fate again to solo tank, which didn't really do anything. It appeared Moon was just trying to help his children get jobs before Overwatch League ended. Instead of being in a tier of their own at the top like we were used to, they were in a tier of their own at the bottom like 2018. This team was so bad. Their final season ended 5-8 with 3 wins against Overwatch League teams and 2 against contenders rosters. The situation is quite anticlimactic, just a rocket to the bottom fall for 2023. It's so disappointing in the sense of how successful Dragons were at this point. They had so many fantastic moments outside of 2018 through their 6-year run in Overwatch League. Being the team who defeated GOATs, if you will, holding one of the greatest rosters of all time, having 2 of the most dominant seasons in both 2020 and 2021, winning 6 stages and a ring. Going from all of this to fielding your average North American Overwatch Champion Series roster in 2023. Just fucking garbage. Even with this pathetic ending, Shanghai Dragons have still cemented themselves in the history books, not just as an Overwatch League team, but as a franchise in general. You can't look at many organizations that are so successful and so bad in the same breath. The allure is almost unparalleled. Only ones like Shock or Dallas Fuel even compare to the raw entertainment given to us by them. There were so many ups and downs, it makes your head spin. I'm hoping in Overwatch Champion Series, some sort of rebrand is implemented back to see what other hogwash they will put into this world, and add more to their story. So from the 0 and 40s to the random who are you moments of carrying his team with Genji, to defeating a meta that bored me to death, thank the heavens for Shanghai Dragons.